My name is Tomi Tonomura, and I am going to introduce today's speaker. But before I do that, hi, Ethan. Before I do that, there are a couple of announcements I have been asked to make. The first one is that if you wish to know the schedule of all of our noon lectures, this flyer is on the table, so please pick that up. It occurs irregularly, not every week and so on, so if you could please pick that up and see what may be interesting to you. The second announcement that is that you may, if you live in Ann Arbor, you may have already heard the buzz in town, but in partnership with the State Theater Center for Japanese Studies, is sponsoring a series of Studio Ghibli films titled the Studio Ghibli Collection, a 30-year retrospective. The series celebrates the 30 years anniversary of Studio. The anniversary is actually next year, 2015, soon. And the film director Miyazaki Hayao's receipt of the Honorary Academy Award, he will actually receive that material thing next month on November 8th. The flyer with the full schedule of films is also on the information table near the door, and looks like this. It is really a wonderful set of films that you can go enjoy. So today's speaker is Professor Marnie S. Anderson, who returns to Ann Arbor from Massachusetts, where she is Associate Professor of History at Smith College. Marnie is especially dear to many of us, as you have already witnessed by the many hugs that she gets. She was our own PhD student in the history department, and also she undertook this very rigorous program of women's studies certificate program, so she had double burden, which she handled marvelously. Prior to enrolling in our programs, Marnie had already distinguished herself as an undergraduate student at Smith College, where she majored in East Asian Studies and graduated with magna cum laude with highest honors. After arriving at the University of Michigan, despite doing the Women's Studies Certificate program in addition to the normal load in history department, she swiftly went through coursework amazingly and received the Japan Foundation and Fulbright and another Fulbright, I think, fellowships, did the research in Japan deeply but efficiently, and next thing we knew, she had the job at Smith College. So she was one of these people who just looked like who just went through so smoothly and so quickly, and it was really marvelous. Marnie's research interests have centered around gender, political culture, nationalism, public space, citizenship, and so on. And she has written on women's agency and activism, starting with her beautifully narrated dissertation, Women's Place, it was called Gender Politics and State in Meiji Japan, which was transformed into a book titled A Place in Public, Women's Rights in Meiji Japan. And it was published by Harvard University Press. Marnie was, I would say, Marnie is a provocateur par excellence. She reads deeply. She's precise in her analyses of especially vocabulary that is used in historical sources. She's highly analytical and a graceful, beautiful writer. And that's how she can write so quickly and beautifully, I think. Oh yes, I do have to say, I'm sorry, one incident. I was at the University of Tokyo Archive, Historiographic Archive, and we were at this Women's Studies Conference or something, and we were talking many senior women, and Marnie was there too, but she has no fear of gracefully introducing her critique of senior scholars' work. That is one of her traits. So today she will offer a lecture from her current research project, and it's titled From Geisha to Activist, Sumiya Koume and the Gender System in Modern Japan. Marnie, please come here. Let's welcome Marnie Anderson.
That was the most memorable introduction I've ever had, so thank you very much, Professor Tonomura. I'm thrilled to be here today, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces and so many new ones as well. I had a moment, sort of a flashback, where when I was filling out my W-9 form for Yuri Fukazawa, I wrote that my email address was my Yumish address, so I'm sort of like clearly having some, flashbacks to the past today. So today I'm going to talk about two topics that I confess I have long avoided. These include geisha and Christian missionaries in Meiji Japan. Okay, so I'll just start. And I know that we had talked about me wearing a clip microphone, but is this okay? Okay. So in 1893, a woman named Sumiya Koume wrote an essay for the prominent women's journal, Jogaku Zasshi, entitled Geisha Should Not Become Concubines. In it, she exhorted women who were serving as geisha not to take the additional step of becoming a concubine. She didn't think that highly of the geisha profession either. What she didn't mention is that she herself had worked as both a geisha and a concubine. And by the time she wrote her essay, she'd also worked as a political activist, as well as a social reformer and missionary. This talk focuses on the life of Sumiya and analyzes what it reveals about opportunities for some women in late 19th century Japan. Sumiya's story does not fit easily into the established frameworks for this era that use the birth of feminism and the role good wife, wise mother for analyzing Japanese women. To shed light on her many careers, I address several representations of Sumiya in Japanese and in English from the 1890s, including her previously mentioned essay. I should just add here that I am PowerPoint challenged in spite of all the wonderful things Professor Tonomura said about me. So you're probably just going to see this image until the end of the talk, and then I'll remember to show you a few others. So I'm just going to confess that up front. When Fabian Drixler's here in a few weeks, you'll have a much prettier slideshow, I guarantee. Okay. So the context here is the few decades after Japan's very rapid and highly successful modern restoration of 1868. And in the end of this talk, I'm going to consider what Sumiya's life reveals about changes in what I am calling, following a number of other scholars, the gender system across the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The transformations that followed hardened the boundaries of gender roles and made a trajectory like Sumiya's unthinkable by the 1930s. I should say here that I'm interested in a number of issues, including how to write a history with a sparse record, as well as how to deal with what turn out to be vastly different representations of Sumiya in English and Japanese. I'm struck, too, by how different the modern Japanese scholarship is from 19th century Japanese texts. So this is a story of how sensibilities and customs change, how things go from being unremarkable to significant, and from fluid to settled regarding women's roles. I'm still working through many of these issues, and I would welcome your feedback. Now, Sumiya remains a largely unknown figure in the scholarly literature on Japanese history. She appears in passing in some treatments of the freedom and popular rights movement or freedom and people's rights movement of the 1880s, or in accounts of the Okayama orphanage, a famous institution of the Meiji period, and in the eyes of some scholars, the precursor of the modern welfare system. Perhaps the best way to situate Sumiya is to place her alongside the famous activist Fukuda, or Kageyama Hideko, a radical who cast herself as a Japanese Joan of Arc. Not only were both women born to lower-level samurai families in the same district of Okayama City, but both shared an interest in people's rights thought and participated in the Okayama Women's Friendship Society in the 1880s, apparently the first women's political group formed in Meiji Japan. Sumiya, however, was 15 years older than Fukuda, and her story stands out in part because of her life prior to her engagement with people's rights politics. As we have seen, Sumiya served as a geisha until a patron bought out her contract and installed her as his concubine. I'll move to a more extensive biography in a little while, but let me just sort of give you a sense of where we're headed. After a few years at her patron's house, she left him, became a Christian, and joined the Okayama Women's Friendship Society. And a few years later, she opened up a school with the help of missionaries, and then later on went to work for the Okayama orphanage. So in reading about Sumiya's life, I was struck by the way she was able to move around in public space, and that her past as a geisha and concubine did not prevent her from carving out a later identity as a pillar of the local church community and a central figure in running the orphanage. I'm very aware that my surprise says a lot about my own preconceptions and presentism. I think it also gets at this question of how perceptions change and the fact that Sumiya was living in the midst of a monumental change. So I have two goals today. First, I'm going to recreate her life by sifting through the available sources. While 19th century primary sources about Sumiya in Japanese are relatively scarce, there are several references to her in English due to her extensive contact with Protestant missionaries. I'm going to draw primarily on the Japanese Women's Journal, Jogakuzashi, for Japanese materials, which contains articles about her and the one by her that I mentioned, as well as English language missionary literature, notably from the magazine Life and Light for Woman. Now, to give you a sense of this Life and Light for Woman, what this literature is like, and maybe why it took me a while to get around to using it, I'm going to read an excerpt from 1912, which describes Sumiya's interactions with a female missionary named Eliza Talcott. So, referring to Talcott's time in Okayama, the writer notes, "Here Talcott found and saved the earnest little Bible woman, Mrs. Sumiya, once a fascinating geisha, then the petted mistress of one of Okayama's foremost citizens. Like a mother, she taught and cherished the girl who literally gave up all for Christ, and together they two have saved and blessed hundreds of the lonely, the sorrowing, the sin-sick women of this land of all ranks and conditions of life." Now, in this passage, Sumiya appears as a poster child for the missionary cause, a role that she continues to fulfill even in a very recent English language publication from 2010 that was published actually out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. In contrast to the English language sources, however, 19th century Japanese texts understandably took a far less sensational approach to her life. So my second question is, from a broader perspective, what her life tells us about changes in the gender system. How, specifically, does her story challenge conventional understandings of a woman's place in modernizing Japan? While scholars normally divide women of this period into two categories, those based in households and those available for hire, I argue that this framework is too limiting for understanding the actual experiences of some women, just as I have suggested that the good wife, wise mother paradigm and birth of feminism have limitations as conceptual frameworks. I propose that the late 19th century, constituted a moment of transition in perceptions about women, in part, of course, given the turmoil surrounding the Meiji Restoration and the dislocations that followed. Only in subsequent decades did such markers, experience as a geisha, a concubine, or a prostitute, become more fixed and central to one's identity, or at the very least central to textual representations of it. In the end, I sketch out some possible ways of understanding changes in the gender system as divisions among different kinds of women became more clearly articulated. Not only do we see transformations in public space and categories of women, but by the 1930s, we can detect an increasing emphasis on monogamy and chastity for men as well, many decades after the 1898 Civil Code first made monogamy the law of the land. Now, a few words about my methodology. I'm using Sumiya's life then to ask larger questions in addition to recreating it. I'm not arguing that her story fundamentally challenges our understanding of major social movements such as the People's Rights Movement or the anti-prostitution movement or even perspectives on Meiji Christianity. The limited sources do not permit such bold claims. I would add, though, that I think her life complicates our understanding of all of these movements. I'm also not suggesting that Sumiya was somehow representative of other women with similar life trajectories. Rather, my approach borrows from microhistory and newer approaches to historical biography. As Jeff Ely explains, historians in the 1980s reconceived the genre of biography as a place to ask complicated questions. And Ely writes that, quote, individual lives might now be revised as complex texts in which the large questions that inspired the social historian were embedded. The intersection of elaborate and multiform forces might be traced through and inside a particular life, allowing the generalized and the abstract to be focused through the personal and particular. So I'm using Sumiya's story then to shed light on this transformation in gender relations, and I'm going to turn now to her background in more depth. So as I mentioned, she was born in 1850, near the end of the Tokugawa period, to a lower-level samurai family in southwestern Okayama City. Her father worked as a temple administrator, not far from Okayama Castle, but her parents died probably in a cholera epidemic when she was quite young. So she was raised by her grandmother and her maternal uncle. She apparently started to learn to dance and play the shamisen when she was 5, and by her late teens, she was an accomplished teacher who had several students. Now, out of necessity, she became a geisha at a nearby restaurant around the time of the Meiji Restoration, so she would have been about 17 or 18. She later, at some point, became a concubine of a patron who had bought out her contract. This man was the local notable and famously eccentric Nakagawa Yokotaro. She began living with Nakagawa and his wife, and in 1877 gave birth to a daughter. Now, in the mid-1870s, Nakagawa, a local bureaucrat who was interested in all things novel, developed an interest in Christianity. His interests also included hygiene, Western medicine, and education for girls. All these facts are missing from the English language missionary literature, as we'll see. They tend to view him as an illiterate, boorish man. In any case, as early as 1875, Nakagawa brought in Western missionaries from nearby Kobe and sponsored sermons at his house. Sumiya first heard about Christian ideas through these sermons and no doubt became aware of some of the schools that Protestant missionaries were establishing around the country for women and girls. In 1878, she went to study at a girls' school in Kobe, the predecessor of today's Kobe College. However, it's probably less than a year later, she was called back to Okayama by Nakagawa, who apparently sent a false telegram telling her that her adopted father was critically ill. He just wanted her back. In addition to this short-lived experience in Kobe, some historians think that she probably had some education in her youth because there were at least 2 academies in her small district in Okayama, including one run by Fukuda Hideko's family. So a few points about the larger historical context. As many of you no doubt know, the 1870s marked a time when the Japanese were attempting to attain parity with the Western powers by overturning the unequal treaties, and civilization and enlightenment was the slogan of the day. The term referred to all manner of social, political, and economic reform. A particular interest here are the links between Christianity, local notables, and the Enlightenment project at the local level. For the primary advocates of civilization and enlightenment were local men of influence like Nakagawa. And at this point, at least, Christianity is associated with civilization and enlightenment. In the following decade, Christian membership jumps. And Okayama seems to have had a particularly high concentration of missionaries early on, so that by 1880, there was an Okayama church. So back to Sumiya's encounter with the gospel, it seems that her exposure to Christianity and her newfound faith led her to desire a new life. She no longer wished to be a concubine. Although it is easy to imagine that her encounter with Christian ideas contributed to her decision, she may also have been influenced by some of the contemporary debates in the Japanese press about the rights of concubines, a subject I'll return to later. With the help of local missionaries, she left the Nakagawa house, leaving her daughter behind at Nakagawa's insistence. And in 1881, she was baptized at the Okayama church. She was in a very difficult position financially, for she lacked the means to support herself, and Nakagawa had been supporting her adopted father as well. At this point, she was hired by a local missionary's wife as a translator or a Japanese teacher. There are different records of this, to help spread the gospel. And the following year, in 1882, she becomes involved with the Okayama Women's Friendship Society, the society associated with the Freedom and People's Rights movement. How exactly she came to join this group is unclear, although the ways that local Christian and people's rights networks overlapped in Okayama no doubt had something to do with it. It's also possible that Sumiya knew about the women's group, that given, again, that she'd grown up in the same district as some of the other members, including Fukuda Hideko and Fukuda Hideko's mother. The following year, at the age of 33, Sumiya delivered a speech to the Okayama Women's Friendship Society entitled "The Cherry Blossoms in the Valley." Unfortunately, like so many women's speeches from this period, we don't have the text. But judging from this text we do have, we can guess that she probably called for raising women's status and perhaps touched on natural rights. Shortly thereafter, in 1886, she worked with local missionaries to open up a school in Okayama. She filed the application with local authorities and identified the school's aim as to educate interested women of all ages and boys under the age of 15. The school remained open until 1890 and had 90 students registered at one point, including a 60-year-old widow. It seems to have closed in the midst of a wave of anti-Western sentiment. At roughly the same time, Sumiya began assisting Ishii Juji with the Okayama orphanage, and he's always known as the founder, although I have come to sort of question that, as you'll see. She played a central role in running the institution. She took fundraising trips and ran the institution in his absence. It seems likely that during one of her fundraising trips that she probably met up with writers for Jogaku雑in Tokyo, and I'm guessing that this is what led her to write the article for the magazine that I began my talk with, entitled Geisha Should Not Become Concubines. And I want to turn to that talk now. So Sumiya left few sources in her own hand, so this essay from 1893 is of special interest. We know a lot about what other people, including public intellectuals, government officials, and female reformers, thought about concubinage. But to my knowledge, this is the only source written by someone who'd actually worked as a concubine, even though she doesn't touch on this directly in her essay. Several themes stand out to the reader. To begin with, she stresses women's natural role as wives and mothers and states that, quote, becoming a concubine goes against women's nature. Now, a lot of scholars have pointed out that opposition during this period to prostitution, concubinage, geisha, categories that are usually grouped together in the language of the time, that these reformers were driven by a sense of disdain for prostitutes and geisha and concubines. But Sumiya's essay shows that not all women who opposed prostitution and concubinage saw themselves as superior or viewed women for hire as belonging to a lower order. She doesn't rely primarily on moral categories to judge concubines, or wives for that matter, but rather focuses on enumerating the concrete problems that rise with the presence of a concubine. She doesn't concern herself with property and inheritance issues in the way some members of the Japan Women's Christian Temperance Union did at roughly the same time. Instead, her views are rooted in the painful experiences all members of the household face when a concubine is present. Sumiya begins by stating, quote, in the world, women's roles are as follows: to be good wives and good mothers, to help husbands and educate children, to run households, and to help benefit the state. But there is something that damages good women, ruins households, and causes confusion to the state. This is geisha and prostitutes. It becomes clear that she doesn't approve of either, but her focus is on advising geisha that they shouldn't take that additional step. She explains that it may be an attractive step for a geisha, and prostitutes, especially as they age and need security. But she says what such women may not appreciate are the consequences, and her essay illuminates the specific problems that arise when wives and concubines live together. These problems continue, she says, even if the concubine has her own living quarters. The presence of a concubine affects all members of the household negatively, including the children and the husband. Once a concubine arrives, the trouble begins, although it may take a while to manifest. No one behaves well and everyone suffers. Interestingly, Sumiya explains the bad behavior of all parties, including the husbands, wives, concubines, and children, in terms of inevitable structural problems. For instance, she points out that the husband, in the process of going back and forth between two women, quote, loses his freedom. Furthermore, while prospective concubines may imagine that they will enjoy a high social status, they deceive themselves, for their men cannot even take them out in public. I'm not exactly sure what that means, so if you have any ideas, let me know. While Sumiya judges concubines quite harshly at times in this essay, for example, she declares that their lives are steeped in sin and that they, quote, steal other people's husbands. She also expresses a degree of understanding for women who find themselves in these bad situations where they have no other means of support. In fact, she's sympathetic on occasion to all parties and even allows for good intentions, stating that a concubine may initially not wish to cause trouble for the wife, although that is surely what will happen. To imagine otherwise, she says, is to, quote, deceive oneself. The only group that Sumiya targets unsparingly in this essay is the parents and brothers who sell their daughters and sisters in the first place, especially those who do not work themselves. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this essay is that Sumiya puts the burden on concubines or potential concubines to leave men, rather than calling on men to stop procuring concubines or for the government to ban the practice. Concubines, writes Sumiya, should think of the greater good and not be swayed by any pressures from men to stay in the household. They should, quote, think of other women's hearts and the future of the descendants. Even if they are despised and hated and told they do not know the meaning of obligation, concubines should leave the men, end quote. Although a man may hate his former concubine, she writes, most people involved in the situation will be happy. In general, Sumiya sees it as women's job to reform men's, quote, lustfulness and uncleanliness, for men cannot control their desires. Nor does she seem to think that wives have much power in this situation. Given that men cannot control themselves and that wives are largely powerless, she concludes that the concubines must be the ones to leave. Later on, she writes that if women can manage to clean up the household, this will result in the happiness of the household as well as benefit to the state. And I think here by women she meant both wives and concubines, although presumably each had a different role to play. While Sumiya attributes agency to concubines in this essay and calls on them to leave households, it deserves mention that by the time she wrote in 1893, concubines had lost legal standing. In the early 1870s, concubines and wives were both listed in household registries, but they disappeared, however, after the 1882 Criminal Code. And the Civil Code of 1898, which was 5 years after this essay, reinforced monogamy. So we're in the middle of a big transition here. Certainly the practice of keeping concubines persisted, much to the dismay of women's groups, and the government seems to have done nothing to stop it. I mean, this was never the intention anyway of the government. Moreover, even though the Meiji Civil Code enforced monogamy, fathers could still declare children born to women other than their wives legitimate. But the larger picture here is one where, due to multiple factors, the desire to look civilized to the West, the push to overturn the unequal treaties with the Western powers, and pressure from groups such as the JWCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, concubines disappeared, not just in law, but over time the practice too was on the decline. In Geisha Should Not Become Concubines, Sumiya does not touch on her own case, as I have noted, but her experience no doubt informed her critique. As I have suggested, her essay represents a case where a woman's life experience drove her to oppose the system, rather than a sense of superiority over what she perceived as socially inferior women. She ends by declaring, quote, there is nothing in the world that gives others as much unhappiness as becoming a concubine. And for her, such statements were probably not mere hyperbole. Now, one historian credits Sumiya for publishing her essay in Jogakusashi at this time, for her former patron and his wife were still alive, and the essay would no doubt have piqued curiosity about her background. I'm actually beginning to question this interpretation because in light of some things I've read recently that suggest that Sumiya and Nakagawa's wife were sort of the pillars of the Okoyama church throughout their lives. So my guess is that somehow they managed to work this out, but in any case. We have limited clues as to how the text was received. Modern historians, though, tend to assume that her text persuaded people to quit, given how she being concubines and geisha. Given how she lays out the situation, this assertion that many concubines left after hearing her message seems plausible, though precisely where they would have heard her speak is not entirely clear. We do know from a collection of memories that was published 20 years after her death that apparently at one point she managed to get the most famous geisha in all of Okayama to quit the profession. So she also convinced the patron that the geisha didn't owe him any money or anything. So she was known among her friends for this. Okay. I'm going to turn now to representations of Sumiya in Japanese at roughly the same moment. The first is by Iwamoto Yoshiharu, who many of you know as the editor of Jogakusashi. He introduced her piece to readers. The purpose of the article, he explained, was to educate. Many people in the anti-prostitution movement, he wrote, had no first-hand knowledge of geisha and concubines, so this piece would be an invaluable reference, he thought. His introduction is worth quoting at some length for the way he introduced Sumiya as well as for what he identified as the value of the essay. The essay that follows, this is all a quote from Iwamoto, is written by Sumiya Koume, the assistant to Ishii Juji, founder of the Okayama Orphanage. In a straightforward way, she sees the truth and cuts to the heart of it thoroughly. Thanks to her proselytizing, not a few people have quit being concubines. I have no doubt that this message does not apply to any readers of this magazine. That is, Iwamoto was assuming that none of his readers had been concubines or geisha or were currently concubines or geisha. But there are many readers who wish to urge geisha and concubines to quit. Such people are very noble-minded, but do not know the true situation of geisha and concubines. So reading this essay will help them understand a number of things. It would be even better if they read it and talked about it with others. Now, it's a bit hard to know what to make of Iwamoto's comments. He clearly had some assumptions about his readership. And yet he wasn't entirely unsympathetic to prostitutes. For example, some scholars note he did write an essay called Our Sisters Are Prostitutes in 1885, suggesting that in his mind, compassion and prejudice combined in complicated ways. It's possible that he knew about Sumiya's past but judged it unimportant, given that Sumiya had been saved by her faith in Christianity, and hence his focus on her as the assistant to Ishii Juji. Whatever the case, we should bear in mind that in any society, individuals might hold, and this is from the work of Helen Horowitz, who's a U.S. historian, they might hold multiple understandings about sex and be divided among themselves. Although Meiji-era commentators discuss sex work as a stain on the empire, it seems that for many Meiji-era Japanese, the stain dissolved, if it had ever existed in the first place, once one moved on. Now, in addition to Iwamoto's introduction, which portrays Sumiya primarily as Ishii's assistant, we also have Ishii's thoughts on Sumiya from an essay 1 year later, on an occasion when reporters for Jogakuzashi visited the orphanage. In his interview, Ishii highlighted Sumiya's central importance to the project. Indeed, he gave her far more credit than the missionaries and Iwamoto did. Here is how the reporter summarized Ishii's comments. Quote, Ishii says, if one wants to accomplish something, a sympathetic friend is necessary, or one will not succeed. For him, that person is the woman of strong faith, Sumiya Koume. When he has experienced trouble on a number of occasions, but stayed firm and unmoving, it is thanks to the strength of Sumiya. As Ishii declares, quote, the achievements of the orphanage are not my own. They are the achievements of Sumiya, end quote. Of all the Meiji-era portrayals of Sumiya, Ishii's is the most glowing and revealing of her central role in running the institution. My next section is called Exposing Sumiya. So around the same time, we can find a very different reaction to Sumiya in the miscellaneous news section of the daily newspaper Yomiuri Shimbun. This piece, entitled Geisha and Concubines, summarized Sumiya's article in Jogakuzashi. The author critiqued her efforts and suggested that she had stepped out of line. He claimed, I'm assuming the author was a he with good reason, that by, quote, breaking apart the inner curtain on geisha and concubines and dissecting their subjective feelings, she relates the immoral and impure aspects of their lives, end quote. Throughout, the author aimed to cast doubt on Sumiya personally by exposing her past and suggesting that Sumiya had no business relating what went on in the lives of geisha and concubines. Unlike other Japanese language representations of Sumiya from this period, the author recounted her personal history. Quote, now she is an assistant at the Okayama orphanage, but in her youth she worked in that area as a popular geisha, flirting with many customers. Later she became a concubine and was bought by a wealthy family, end quote. While he perhaps aimed to blunt the force of her critique, his reasons for doing so are harder to pinpoint. Perhaps he meant to suggest she was fickle, given her past, or perhaps he thought she had no right to judge such situations. In the end, he pronounced and dismissed her work as a form of zange. So the term zange, and I'm borrowing here from the literary scholar Christine Marin, had religious roots and can be translated as repentance or confession. Now, a number of writers produced zange around the turn of the century, and the women associated with the genre are usually ex-convicts. Given that Sumiya doesn't touch on her own past, and that she wasn't a former criminal, it's interesting that the author chose to categorize her work this way. It's true that she shared with zange writers a distinct change in direction, but her article does not represent a case where and I'm quoting from Marin here, the speaking subject's self-proclaimed social rehabilitation plays an essential role. So in short, the zange term is a bit of an odd fit, I think. Notably, the author seems not to have opposed Sumiya's ability to leave the geisha life behind, nor her work as a geisha and a concubine, but that she had crossed a line by exposing details about the lives of concubines that should not be exposed. In highlighting a divide between the genteel women who read Jogakuzashi and geisha and concubines, the article demonstrates that some contemporaries upheld a division between good women in households and women who could be bought. Other commentators, as we have seen, were not intent on maintaining such a clear divide, nor drawing attention to an individual's past. When read together with Ishii and Iwamoto's descriptions, the Yomiuri article illustrates how within any society we can have multiple attitudes about sex and, by extension, women. Okay, it's hot in here. All right. So in 1897, so a few years after these articles appear, Sumiya received extensive coverage in English along with Ishii in the Missionary magazine Life and Light for Woman. The sketch of Sumiya is entitled Koume Sumiya, the Japanese Bible Woman. And the author, Belpetti, was in fact the missionary woman who'd hired Sumiya after she left her patron's house. In general, Light and Life for Women featured stories touting missionary successes and providing biographies of converts. The piece on Sumiya highlighted her past experience as a concubine, though not as a geisha, and her escape from this life, thus showcasing the redemptive power of Christianity. Several aspects of Sumiya's story here stand out. The first is the way the author portrays her journey from sin to salvation and her inherently good nature in spite of a number of challenges, including chronic asthma. Simply put, she was a victim of her circumstances who had nevertheless managed to overcome them. In many instances, the text portrays her as lacking agency. Events simply happened to her. Also noteworthy is the way the author relies on veiled language to describe Sumiya's past. Rather than revealing that she was a geisha, the author refers to her talents as a musician who taught the neighborhood children. After her grandmother's death, the article continues, quote, an Okayama friend, a man who had become interested in her through her music, invited her into his family. The article calls this man Mr. N. Sumiya eventually agreed, and according to the piece, served as his secretary as he was, quote, unable to read or write. Now, Mr. N is no doubt Nakagawa, who was in fact highly literate and even the author of several books, although he was apparently not fond of reading and did use Sumiya as a secretary. But we might pause to ask why the author describes Sumiya as a secretary and doesn't mention her past experience as a geisha. Was the author reluctant to offend the reader's sensibilities? Perhaps the role of secretary provided a way for Sumiya to enter Nakagawa's house in a manner readers would have found less objectionable. Whatever the case, the text makes clear that the relationship evolved into something more. Lest the reader wonder what Nakagawa's wife thought, readers are assured that, quote, there was no love between her employer and his wife, and Koume became more and more his trusted helper, and, as is too common in that country, his wife in reality, though not in name. So, in the longer version of this paper, I attend to more details of the conversion experience, but let me just skip over that a bit and give you the big picture. Sumiya's encounter with Christianity moves her to want to leave Nakagawa, and she faces a lot of pressure from him to stay. The text is very dramatic and culminates in her getting very, very sick. She eventually recovers, however, and, quote, as she grew stronger, Miss Talcott, we're back to Eliza Talcott, Miss Talcott used her influence with Mr. N, and he finally consented to give Sumiya up for a while, at least, end quote. So Sumiya appears strangely passive here, for the text credits the Western missionary Miss Talcott for Sumiya's decision. Now, in contrast, Japanese scholars portray Talcott as playing a role, but in the end, the decision emerges as Sumiya's alone. At times, the reader finds it hard to follow the logic of this article or to imagine the sources of the text insofar as it contains a number of errors and information that can't be verified by other accounts. A discussion of the shortcomings of Sumiya's adopted father slips effortlessly to a discussion of her patron and the difficulties involved in getting him to give up his daughter with Sumiya. Overall, the article portrays Japanese men as morally bankrupt and practically interchangeable with one another, with the exception of committed Christian converts like Ishii. Once she left Nakagawa, her life became quite difficult since she had no financial support. She underwent a dramatic conversion experience and decided to become baptized, receiving no support from her adopted father, who had, quote, lived in comfort on her wages of sin, end quote. Again, as if all Japanese men are somehow the same, the text moves back from the adopted father to Nakagawa, who had pressed Sumiya for 2 years to come back and refused to grant her custody of their child. At last, the text says, Nakagawa yielded, quote, less for her sake than for the sake of the little one who pined and fretted for her mother. At roughly the same moment, Sumiya found employment with one of the missionary ladies, though the author doesn't out herself and say she is the woman. However, Sumiya's true wish was to work for such women as she had been, so she opened a school for, quote, teaching English, foreign sewing and knitting, and as much Christianity as could be put into it. The school was successful, but came to an end in 1890, not merely because of the reaction against all things foreign, but also due to her poor health. Here I think it was actually just that she was working on the Okayama orphanage full time, but that's my own interpretation. So overall, this narrative moves from a focus on hardship to a happy ending, concluding on a hopeful note that emphasizes Sumiya's positive influence over so many of the faithful Christian converts in Okayama. In contrast, the author downplays her role at the orphanage, but allows that her influence on Ishii is powerful. After all, he credited Sumiya with being the mother of his faith. As we have seen in a number of places, the text paints her as passive, for instance, when she severs ties with Nakagawa, resulting in a very curious blend. Where she lacks power over Nakagawa and her adopted father, her influence over local people remains considerable. So in short, the text only allows her certain kinds of influence. In the end, Sumiya emerges as a model convert and a pillar of the church community. The description serves to make her a very likable figure and endear our little plum blossom, as the text calls her, translating her name Koume, to the audience. In Life and Light for Women, figures like Sumiya demonstrate the success of the missionary cause and hold out hope for the future. I'd like to take a bit of time to think about what these texts tell us about 19th century Japanese views on, or Western views on Japanese women. We definitely encounter them in this article. Accounts by Western visitors during this era often failed to distinguish between Japanese prostitutes and wives, leading to some distress on the part of Japanese women. Indeed, in his 1876 The Mikado's Empire, William Elliot Griffiths portrayed all Japanese women as potential prostitutes. I'll spare you the quote for now. Views about prostitution in the West no doubt also played a role in shaping Westerners' perceptions about Japanese women who could be hired. Overall, in the West, American commentators in particular tended to view prostitutes as people who had been victimized by economic circumstances beyond their control. This discourse of victimization was central to how Westerners viewed Sumiya. One effect of portraying her as a victim is that she's not seen as deserving for her past. And at the same time, this description renders her passive and one-dimensional, and the focus on her illness only highlights her passivity. She was definitely a model convert, and the passage that deems her the, quote, most devoted Christian woman in Okayama appears in a number of contemporary missionary publications. Life and Light for Women portrays her work in ways that largely upheld gender stereotypes of women performing a supportive role. She counseled individuals in need, founded a school, and worked as a shepherd of wandering church members. The text does not highlight her important role at the Okayama orphanage, and one cannot but be struck by the difference between Ishii's glowing comments about her and the text here. Okay. Another theme that comes up in here centers on Christian networks. Clearly, contact with missionaries is a theme that runs throughout her life. And what's interesting is that Western texts tend to view missionary influence as decisive, as we've seen. Japanese sources tend not to. They see it as having, some impact. But in fact, in some cases, Japanese sources tend to push back, noting how much influence Sumiya had on the missionaries. And in fact, thanks to her wonderful training, that the converts were able to learn the true virtues of Japanese women and convert women from the upper classes. So, in focusing on her past as a concubine and seeing it as a defining experience, a mark that never went away, Westerners' perspectives and assumptions from the late 19th century are in some ways much closer to those of scholars in the present in Japan and beyond. Even though the Yomiuri reporter exposed her past, he conceded that Sumiya had moved on. The 19th century Western writers had a different analytical angle, however, for they felt no need to understand how she ended up where she was. The answer was self-evident. She had found religion. Okay. I'm moving to my end part, but I'm wondering, did we get started late, or have I really been rattling on this long? It's okay? All right. Okay. So, Here, I want to take her story and think in larger ways about what her life reveals about larger changes in the gender system and the organization of public space across the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this partly comes out of my view that Meiji historians, people who study Meiji and after, and I include myself among these folks, tend to focus on really small moments recently, whereas historians of earlier periods have tended to do a better job of asking big questions. And so I'm trying to ask big questions in this section. So I'm going to draw on the work of a number of scholars to offer a tentative and partial sketch of how some changes in the gender system affected women and men roughly through the 30s, when the extent of the changes becomes most evident. I propose that modernity resulted in a hardening of gender categories, especially the divide between women in households and women for hire. At the same time, these categories underwent internal changes as well. I'm going to focus on three aspects of this shift. The first is changes in access to public space. The second is changes in different categories of women. Categories like geisha and prostitute became more stable, and the fluidity that had characterized them receded. And the third transformation is in ideas about monogamy and chastity for both sexes. The 1880s marked the height of Sumiya's mobility. She left her patron and became an activist and reformer. During this period of flux, questions about gendered access to public space were also evident in elite levels of society in what might be called the dinner party debates. Sally Hastings has illuminated how Japanese elites used dinner parties, balls, and other social gatherings to present themselves as civilized to Westerners. The Western practice of husbands and wives socializing together, which the Japanese felt compelled to adopt, brought a number of issues to the fore. In the past, geisha had been the only women at the party, but the presence of both geisha and wives, and many wives of the Meiji oligarchs were former geisha, sparked competition among women. Such gatherings inspired a number of views among social commentators. Fukuzawa Yukichi wanted geisha to disappear entirely. He wanted Westerners to have no reason to complain. Meanwhile, some married women feared that by engaging in geisha-like behavior, they would be unnecessarily sexualized. To Japanese women who had been abroad to the West, Hastings writes, the struggle for the dinner party became synonymous with the struggle of wives against concubines, geisha, and prostitutes, end quote. In the end, dinner parties fell by the wayside in the late 1880s as part of the widespread conservative reaction against all things Western. However, the issue of what kind of women should appear in various types of public spaces would persist. Transformations in gendered configurations of space also manifested themselves at the level of the imperial household, as the monarchy refashioned itself as civilized and modern. In the years surrounding the turn of the 20th century, we know from the work of Takashi Fujitani that newspapers anticipated that the future Taisho emperor would be monogamous, and at the same time criticized the traditional practice of polygamy, even as newspapers were silent about the fact that the Meiji emperor, who was currently reigning, was not monogamous. The work of women's groups, such as the JWCTU, also proved critical in reconfiguring gendered access to public space. JWCTU members and other upper middle class women sought to link public space, especially political and diplomatic space, with certain kinds of femininity. Women for hire were no longer to appear in these spaces, and we have a lot of examples of this. In the 1880s, JWCTU activists start criticizing male politicians for socializing with geisha. In the 1900s, they protest the appearance of geisha at public events, such as the 1903 festival at Kyoto's Kitano Shrine. Reformers prevent geisha from dancing at the enthronement ceremonies for the Taisho emperor. And these critiques even extend to the colonies, for the Governor General of Korea is criticized for welcoming geisha at his New Year celebrations. We can also identify transformations in the women for hire category. As geisha lost their role as innovators at the forefront of fashion, the role went to the cafe waitress. Nevertheless, anxieties about the boundaries between different types of women would persist into the 1930s as the mass media pitted wives against other types of women. This time, as Aiko Tanaka shows, wives were increasingly instructed to employ the tactics of the geisha and the waitress, that is, by polishing their own sex appeal in order to prevent their husbands from wandering. Older ideologies had implied that running the household was enough for a wife to maintain a good marriage, but newer ideas about the centrality of love encouraged women to take on additional roles, to be household managers, caretakers, and seductresses. Transformations in the gender system also affected men, for men were increasingly called on to be monogamous and chaste. Such behavior had long been expected of women in households, at least those of the middle and upper classes. Previously, elite men had access to both wives and other types of female company. Sumiya's former patron, Nakagawa, is a perfect example of this. We might even say that access to such women had underpinned dominant forms of middle and upper class masculinity. The new emphasis on monogamy for middle class men, in practice rather than merely in law, marked a significant shift from the past. Nor was it any longer imaginable for former geisha to marry the political elite, as had happened with oligarchs of the Meiji period. Now, no doubt, we know that relationships with women, continue on the side, but they're less visible. In sum, these changes in the gender system, the legal disappearance of concubines, monogamy and chastity for husbands and wives learning from geisha and waitresses, and yet geisha losing some of their legitimacy and claim on public space, these changes must be understood as interrelated and indicative of a significant shift from the past. Changes became more clear over time, and literary scholar Michiko Suzuki tells us that by the 1920s and 30s, there are a number of treatises that focus on how both men and women should practice chastity. Rarely does one view the Japanese imperial household at the forefront of social change, but in this case, the characterization seems fair, for at least the appearance of monogamy had been promoted decades earlier. The spread of new ideas across society that means that by the 1920s and 30s, we are a long way from the life of Sumiya in the 19th century and the cultural understandings that surrounded her and her former patron. And I should say that she died just shy of the age of 70 in 1920. Historians often address cases where individuals discussed and called for social change, but here across several decades, we see evidence of it quite clearly. Multiple factors can explain transformations in the women for hire category, limiting their movements and access to public space. These include, as we've seen, Western ideas about purity, the efforts of women's groups, and the anti-prostitution movement. Nevertheless, in both the 1890s, when Sumiya wrote, and the 1930s, we find an ongoing debate concerning the extent to which women are responsible for men's sexuality and how they should go about keeping men in line. In the 1890s, Sumiya put the burden on women, especially geisha and concubines, to ensure men's upright behavior. By the 1930s, the conversation had shifted to ask how wives could learn from geisha and waitresses to keep their husbands from straying. Now back to Sumiya's story. What enabled her to do what she did in the late 19th century? No single cause can explain her mobility, but I would suggest that a number of factors converged, including older notions about women engaging in labor as a way to help their families, the turmoil of the Meiji Restoration, her age, the strong networks in which she participated, and the respectability imparted by Christianity and her role as a reformer at the very prominent Okayama orphanage. Surely others besides the Yomiuri reporter knew about her past. Her former patron, after all, was one of the most famous men in Okayama. They simply didn't need to highlight it. We know from the work of a number of scholars that Meiji women moved between roles and in and out of households. A woman might begin as a factory worker, activist, or speaker and become a wife or mother, and sometimes play several roles simultaneously. But Sumiya's multiple careers command attention. Her story matters not because it is representative, a question we rarely ask about men, but because her life reveals unexpected possibilities and paths that shed light on the workings of gender in modern Japan. This ability to move around disappeared as gender categories hardened and divisions among women became more clearly articulated across the first few decades of the 20th century. In the future, I intend to examine other aspects of Sumiya, the geisha turned concubine turned activist and social worker, administrator, and model convert to Western readers past and present. Her trajectory does not fit easily into any of our established frameworks for understanding Meiji women. She may have been a wise mother, but she was never a wife. Nor I think is feminism a particularly useful label to apply to her, unless we use the term very broadly to mean a woman who departed from traditional roles. Late 19th century Japan offered more paths for some women than we have fully appreciated. Thank you.